My brother raised his glass to toast Nathaniel as the new CEO before our father had even finished his sentence, and that's when I knew this whole evening had been choreographed long before I walked through the door. The applause started before Dad even got the words out completely. I stood near the bar cart in the corner of our parents' living room, holding a glass of wine I hadn't touched, watching my younger brother soak in 30 years of family history being handed to him like a birthday present. Everyone in that room had been waiting for this moment, or at least pretending they had, because the truth was, nobody had ever questioned that Nathaniel would run Whitcomb Logistics one day. Not even me, if I'm being honest, even though I was the one who'd kept the company alive when nobody was looking. My name is Claudia Whitcomb, and I was 38 years old the night my father announced his successor in front of 40 relatives, longtime employees, and 2 bottles of champagne that had been sitting in our family's wine cellar since the company's 25th anniversary. My brother had always been the golden child. Not officially, our parents never used those words, but everyone in the family understood the unspoken hierarchy. Nathaniel got the benefit of the doubt. Nathaniel got the second chances. Nathaniel got introduced at parties as our son. He's going to run the family business someday. I got introduced as our daughter. She does something with numbers. What I did with numbers was hold the company together for 6 years while everyone else celebrated my brother's potential. I'd studied accounting at Penn State, while Nathaniel studied business at a more expensive school, 2 states away, the one our parents loved telling people about. After graduation, I came back home to Cleveland and took a junior position in the finance department at Whitcomb Logistics, the trucking and freight company my grandfather built from a single rig in 1968. Nathaniel took a sales role at a tech startup in Austin, chasing something flashier, something with stock options and a skyline view. For years, that was fine. Nobody expected anything different. The assumption had quietly hardened into fact, the same way assumptions do in families that don't talk about the things that actually matter. Someday Nathaniel would come home, take over, and everyone would act surprised that it had worked out exactly the way they'd always planned. I built my career inside that company anyway. I worked my way up to senior controller by 28, and by 32, I was essentially running financial operations for a business that employed nearly 200 people across 4 states. I learned every contract, every client relationship, every weak point in our cash flow. I learned things as my father never bothered to learn himself, because my father was a builder, not a numbers man, and he trusted whoever sat closest to the ledgers. That happened to be me. 3 years ago, in the spring, I found something in our accounts receivable that made my stomach drop. A client we'd been hauling freight for, a regional grocery distributor that represented almost 18% of our annual revenue, was 3 months behind on payments and showing every sign of heading toward bankruptcy. If they went under owing us that much, we wouldn't just take a hit. We'd be looking at layoffs, maybe worse, depending on how our bank reacted to the numbers. I brought it to my father first. He waved it off, told me distributors always run slow on payments in the spring, told me not to worry my pretty head about it, which was a phrase he used more often than he probably realized. I went to Nathaniel next, since he was technically a VP of sales by then, even though he was still working remotely from Austin and flying in twice a month for board meetings he mostly used as an excuse to see old college friends. Nathaniel told me I was being dramatic. So I did something nobody in my family knew about until much later. I quietly restructured our exposure myself. I renegotiated payment terms with 3 smaller clients to free up working capital. I delayed 2 equipment purchases I knew we didn't urgently need. I personally guaranteed a line of credit using collateral from a small inheritance I'd received from my grandmother. Money I'd been saving for a down payment on a house. I never told anyone where that credit line came from. I just made sure it existed. 6 weeks later, the grocery distributor filed for Chapter 11. We lost about 60% of what they owed us. It still hurt. But because of what I'd done quietly, in the background, without anyone's permission or knowledge. The company survived without a single layoff. We didn't miss a single payroll. We didn't even have to explain to our bank why our numbers looked tighter than usual. Because by the time anyone outside the finance department noticed anything, I'd already smoothed it over. I never told my father what I'd done. Honestly, I think part of me didn't want to embarrass him by pointing out he'd ignored a real warning. And part of me, the part I'm less proud of, wanted to see if anyone would ever actually notice on their own. Nobody did. 3 years passed. Nathaniel eventually moved back to Cleveland after his startup got acquired and quietly folded, which he framed to the family as deciding it was finally time to come home and focus on legacy. He took an office down the hall from mine, started showing up to client dinners, started using phrases like synergy and vertical integration that made the longtime truckers in our warehouse roll their eyes when he wasn't looking. My father loved it. My mother cried actual tears of joy the first week he was back, the same way she'd cried when he made varsity baseball in 10th grade. I kept doing my job. I kept the books clean. I kept the company solvent. I didn't expect a parade for it. I just expected, eventually, for someone to ask who'd actually been steering the ship, while everyone admired the captain's uniform. 2 weeks before the dinner party, Nathaniel called me on a Tuesday night, his voice doing that thing where excitement makes people forget to ask if it's a good time to talk. You should start thinking about whether you want to stay in finance or move into a different role, he said. Once Dad officially hands things over to me, I sat very still in my kitchen, phone pressed against my ear. Hands what over exactly? The company, Claudia. Come on, you knew this was coming. He laughed, easy, certain. I already talked to Dad about restructuring the org chart. I'm thinking I'll need someone I trust running point on the West Coast expansion. You'd be great for that. West Coast expansion was a project I had personally modeled the financials for, a project I'd spent 4 months building a business case around, a project I hadn't even fully presented to the board yet, because I wanted the numbers airtight first. Nathaniel was already talking about it like his idea, like his future to hand pieces of away. I didn't argue with him that night. By then, I'd learned there wasn't much point. The dinner party was my parents' idea, technically billed as a celebration of the company's 57th anniversary, though everyone who mattered understood what it actually was. My mother spent 3 weeks planning the menu. My father invited half the warehouse staff, 2 of our longest-standing clients, our family attorney, and our outside accountant, a sharp, quiet man named Walter Ostrowski, who'd handled Wixom logistics audits for almost 15 years, and who I'd worked closely with every single one of those years. I almost didn't go. I told myself I had a work thing, a half-true excuse, but my mother called me twice that week. And there's a particular tone she uses that I've never once successfully said no to. So I went. I wore the navy dress I usually saved for client presentations, the one that makes me feel like I belong in a room, even when I'm not sure I do. The house was full by 7. String lights in the backyard, the good china out, a string quartet. My mother hired that nobody requested, but everyone enjoyed anyway. I stood near the bar cart for most of the early evening, talking to Walter about a depreciation schedule we'd been finalizing. Partly because it was genuinely interesting, and partly because it gave me somewhere to put my hands and my attention that wasn't watching Nathaniel work the room like he'd already won an election. Because that's what it felt like. People kept congratulating him. Aunts I hadn't seen in years squeezed his arm and said things like, "Your grandfather would be so proud." And Nathaniel would do this humble little head tilt, this practiced modesty that made my jaw tighten every single time. At one point, I overheard 2 of our warehouse foremen near the dessert table. Good men, decent men who'd worked for my family for over 20 years between them. "Heard the kid's taking over full-time now," one of them said. "Guess we'll see if he knows where the trucks actually go." I didn't say anything. I just refilled my wine and kept walking. Around 8:30, my father tapped his glass with a fork, the sound cutting cleanly through the noise of 40 conversations. The backyard, quieted in stages, the way crowds do, ripples of silence moving outward from wherever the host is standing. Nathaniel moved toward our father immediately, like he'd been waiting all night for exactly this cue, which he probably had. 57 years ago, my father began, and I could already hear the speech he'd practiced, the cadence of a man who'd given this toast in his head 100 times. My father started this company with one truck and a promise that he'd never let a client down. I've tried to honor that promise every single day since I took over. And tonight, I get to do something I've been looking forward to for a long time. My mother was already crying before he finished the sentence. Nathaniel stood beside him, hands clasped in front of him, doing his best impression of humility. Effective at the start of next quarter, Nathaniel will be stepping in as Chief Executive Officer of Whitcomb Logistics. The applause was immediate and loud. Someone whistled. My father pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. A formal letter, I assumed, something for Nathaniel to hold up for photos, and the moment he extended it toward my brother, several relatives raised their phones to capture it. I clapped too. I want to be honest about that. I clapped because that's what you do, because making a scene at your parents' 50th. Whatever anniversary party has never solved anything in any family I've ever heard of. And because some small tired part of me had already accepted that this was simply how things were going to go. Nathaniel took the envelope, held it up with a grin, and the crowd cheered louder. Then Walter Ostrowski stood up. He didn't make a scene about it. He just stood, the way a man stands when he's about to say something he'd rather not say but feels obligated to. The chair legs scraped against the patio stones, a small sound, but it cut through the applause the way a single off note cuts through a song you've heard 100 times before. People noticed. Conversations near him died first, then spread outward. My father looked over, still smiling, not yet understanding. "Everything all right, Walter?" Walter adjusted his glasses, the same gesture I'd watched him make at the end of every audit meeting for 15 years. The gesture that meant he was about to say something he'd already triple-checked. "There's something that needs to be addressed before this evening goes any further. I'm sorry for the timing." The yard went quiet in a way it hadn't all night. "What is it?" my father asked, and I could hear the first thread of uncertainty in his voice. Walter reached into the leather portfolio he'd carried in earlier, the one I'd assumed held nothing more than dinner notes. He pulled out a sealed envelope, slightly aged at the corners, the kind of envelope that had clearly been sitting in a drawer or a safe for a long time. "This was left with my office 4 years ago," Walter said, "by your father. To be open the day Whitcomb Logistics formally announced new leadership. My grandfather had been gone for 9 years. The mention of him in present tense, in instructions still being carried out from beyond a grave. None of us visited often enough, made my mother's hand fly to her chest. "Dad," my father said slowly, looking at Walter, "what is this?" "Your father set up a provision in the company's ownership structure that none of us were permitted to disclose until this exact moment," Walter said. "I think it's best if I just read it." Nathaniel's grin had not yet faded, not fully, the way confidence doesn't disappear all at once. "I'm sure it's just some sentimental letter, Walter." Grandpa loved a dramatic gesture. Nobody laughed. Walter broke the seal carefully, unfolded 2 pages of handwriting I recognized instantly. The same handwriting that used to sign my birthday cards, slanted and deliberate. He cleared his throat and began to read. "If you're hearing this letter, it means my son has finally named a successor, and the company my father and I built with our hands is being handed to the next generation." A few relatives exchanged glances. The letter had clearly been written with this exact scene in mind, written years in advance, waiting patiently in a drawer for a night none of us knew was being planned for. Walter continued. "For years, it has been assumed by nearly everyone in this family that my grandson Nathaniel would one day run this company." Nathaniel's smile flickered, just slightly, the way a light flickers right before a storm knocks the power out completely. "That assumption was never something I confirmed," Walter read. "And it was never something I intended to honor blindly. The silence that followed felt physical, like something you could lean against. My father's face had gone pale. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "What is this supposed to mean?" my father asked, his voice rising slightly. Walter lowered the page just enough to make eye contact with him. "There's more, Edward. I think you should let me finish." He returned to the letter. 3 years ago, I learned that one of our oldest clients was on the verge of collapse, and that this collapse would have devastated the company, if not for the actions of one person, who acted without authorization, without credit, and without ever telling a soul in this family what she had done. My stomach dropped so fast, I had to set my wine glass down on the bar cart behind me, my hand trembling slightly in a way I hoped nobody noticed. I had Walter quietly look into our financial records that year, the letter continued. After a conversation with an old friend who still worked in our accounts department and happened to mention, in passing, some unusual activity that had kept us afloat during a dangerous quarter. What I found was that my granddaughter, Claudia, had personally guaranteed a line of credit using her own inheritance, restructured client terms without seeking credit or recognition, and protected nearly 200 jobs without ever once mentioning it to anyone, including me. My mother turned to look at me. My father turned to look at me. Nathaniel turned to look at me, and for the first time all evening, his expression had nothing performative left in it at all. I felt my face go hot. I hadn't told anyone, not even Walter directly, though apparently somewhere along the way he'd connected the dots, through bank records he had every right to see during an audit. I'd assumed that secret would stay buried in spreadsheets nobody else cared to dig through. Walter kept reading. "I have spent the years since then deciding what to do with this information. I did not want to embarrass my son by exposing what he failed to notice. I did not want to embarrass my grandson by suggesting he was not capable. But I also could not, in good conscience, allow control of this company to pass to someone based on assumption and affection rather than on demonstrated judgment." My father's hands had started to shake slightly. I could see it from across the yard. "Therefore," Walter read, his voice steady even as the crowd around him had gone completely still, "I have restructured 41% of my personal shares in Whitcomb Logistics into a controlling trust. Upon the announcement of new company leadership, voting control of that trust transfers automatically and irrevocably to its named trustee." He paused, just for a breath, the kind of pause that exists only to let a room catch up with what it's about to hear. "The trustee I have selected is my granddaughter, Claudia Whitcomb." Nobody moved. "I genuinely don't think anybody in that backyard," breathed for several seconds. My mother's mouth opened slightly, no sound coming out. Nathaniel stared at me like he was trying to find some explanation that made this make sense, some version of reality where this hadn't actually happened. "This is insane," Nathaniel finally said, his voice cracking slightly on the second word. "Walter, this can't be legal. Dad runs this company. Dad just named me CEO 5 minutes ago. Your father retains his title," Walter said calmly. "And the operational announcement made tonight stands. But effective immediately, major financial decisions, capital allocation, and any structural changes to the company require sign-off from the trust's controlling shareholder. That's Claudia. Why would Grandpa do this?" Nathaniel's voice had lost all its earlier polish. He looked, for the first time in longer than I could remember, genuinely young and genuinely frightened. Walter glanced down at the letter again. He anticipated that question. "There's one more paragraph." He read slowly this time. "Nathaniel, I love you, and I have watched you grow into a capable, charming man who I believe could do wonderful things. But leadership is not a birthright, and it was never meant to be one in this family, no matter what assumptions took root over the years. Claudia protected what we built when nobody asked her to, and when nobody was watching. That kind of quiet responsibility is worth more than any title, and it is exactly what this company needs steering it forward." My father sat down. He didn't make a decision to sit. His legs simply seemed to stop holding him up, and he lowered himself into the nearest patio chair, staring at the grass. My mother started crying for an entirely different reason than she had been 20 minutes earlier. Nathaniel looked at me, and for a moment the anger in his face cracked into something rawer. "Did you know about this? Did you plan this?" "No," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to. "I had no idea Grandpa even knew what I did 3 years ago. I never told anyone." "Then why didn't you say something tonight, before Dad made his announcement? You could have stopped this from happening like this, in front of everyone." It was a fair question, and I gave him the only honest answer I had. "Because I didn't know this was coming either, Nathaniel. I'm finding out the same way you are." He didn't say anything to that. He just looked down at the envelope, still in his hand, the one our father had given him minutes earlier. The one that probably contained nothing more than a ceremonial letter announcing a title that now meant something different than it had 10 minutes ago. I walked over to where my father sat, crouched down beside his chair the way I used to when I was small, and he'd had a hard day at the warehouse. "Dad." He looked up at me, and there was something in his expression I'd never seen directed at me before, something between shame and a strange, dawning kind of respect. "3 years ago," he said quietly. "You never told me." "I didn't want you to feel like I was keeping score," I said. "I just wanted the company to survive. You used your own money. Your inheritance from Mom's mother. It was just sitting in an account," I said. "The company needed it more." He reached up and took my hand, his grip firmer than I expected from a man who looked like he'd aged 5 years in the last 10 minutes. "I'm sorry," he said, and I understood he wasn't just apologizing for the last 10 minutes. He was apologizing for something much longer than that, something neither of us had ever had the right words for. I turned toward the rest of the yard, toward all those faces still staring, still waiting to understand what they'd just watched happen. "Nobody's losing their job tonight," I said, loud enough to carry. "Nathaniel is still going to be CEO. I'm not interested in running daily operations, and I never have been. I'm interested in making sure this company is still standing for whoever comes after us." I looked at Nathaniel directly. "We're going to figure this out together. The West Coast expansion is real, and it's good. And I'd actually like your help getting it off the ground. If you're willing to actually sit down with the numbers this time instead of just the org chart." Something in his shoulders eased, just slightly, the anger giving way to something more tired and more honest. "I didn't know about any of it," he said quietly. "The grocery distributor, the credit line. None of it." "I know," I said. "That was kind of the point." The string quartet had stopped playing somewhere in the middle of all this, and nobody had noticed until the silence stretched long enough to feel strange. My mother eventually stood, wiped her face, and announced, in a voice that wavered but held, that dessert was getting cold and everyone should please come inside. People moved slowly back toward the house, in clusters, murmuring. The way crowds do after they've witnessed something they'll be discussing in different versions for years. A few relatives hugged me on their way past. Awkward, uncertain hugs. The kind people give when they're not entirely sure what they're congratulating you for. I stayed outside a little longer, looking at the lights strung across the yard. At the empty chair, where my grandfather used to sit every summer telling stories. Nobody quite believed were entirely true. I thought about all those conversations on his back porch when I was younger. The ones where he'd ask me detailed questions about how I was doing in school, what I understood about how businesses actually worked. Questions I'd always assumed were just an old man being kind to his quiet granddaughter. I understood now they'd never been idle questions at all. The envelope was still sitting on the bar cart where Walter had left it. The formal CEO announcement Nathaniel had been handed and then forgotten about in the chaos. I picked it up and walked it inside to where my brother stood near the kitchen island, staring at nothing in particular. "You should keep this," I said, holding it out to him. "It's still yours. Dad still wants you running this company. That part didn't change tonight." He took it slowly, looked at it, then looked at me. "Why are you being so calm about all of this?" "Because it was never about who deserved the title more," I said. It was about who'd actually shown they could protect what Grandpa built, even when nobody was watching, even when nobody asked them to. He nodded, slowly, like the words were settling somewhere they hadn't been able to reach before that night. The party wound down around 11. By the time the last guests left, the backyard lights still glowing faintly against the dark, my father found me in the kitchen drying dishes. My mother insisted on washing by hand, even though we have a perfectly good dishwasher. He stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "Your grandfather always said you reminded him of himself," he said. "I used to think he meant because you were quiet. I don't think that's what he meant at all." I set the towel down. "What do you think he meant?" "I think he meant you noticed things the rest of us were too busy to notice, and you took care of them anyway, without needing anyone to clap for it." I thought about the line of credit I'd guaranteed with money meant for a house I still didn't own. About 3 years of carrying a secret that had never once felt like a burden, because protecting the company had simply felt like the right thing to do, no matter who ended up getting the credit for it. "I don't need anyone clapping for it now either," I said. "I just want it to still be standing in another 57 years. My father nodded slowly, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he looked at me the way he'd always looked at Nathaniel, like he was finally seeing the whole picture instead of just the part of it that had always been easiest to celebrate.